It is now 4 o'clock and it's time to begin. Welcome everyone. I'm Karen MacNeil, author of the Wine Bible and editor of the digital newsletter WineSpeed. And this is a live virtual wine tasting with 3 Merlot producers who are not simply producers of Merlot, but pioneers and Merlot experts in their respective regions. And I'm so excited to have this opportunity to talk with them about really Merlot's historic greatness. And maybe we could even say it's right to reclaim its legacy, because as many of us know, Merlot is very celebrated around the world. Think about Chateau Petrus in Bordeaux and Massetto from Tenuta Ornellaia in Tuscany. And we have our own share of great Merlots on the West Coast of the United States. So thank you for being here. If this is the first time you've joined us, welcome. If you've been with us for other live virtual tastings, we're glad you're back. And we remind you that we love questions, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of them. So we look forward to taking them and to sharing with you some really extraordinary and very special Merlots. So Chris Carpenter, PJ Alviso, and Marty Clubb, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to taste your very impressive wines in a minute here, but let me begin by stating what I think a lot of people know, which is that there are, in a sense, 2 worlds of Merlot. Oceans of kind of soft, innocuous wines, hopefully not very expensive, but then Merlots like yours, structured, intensely flavored, complex wines. I'm wondering if you feel it's a challenge to get wine drinkers to understand that high level of Merlot. Chris, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's been a challenge for a number of years. I think it's changing. My theory about Merlot and how it's come and gone and then come back has a lot to do with the industry's desire to find the next white zin back in the early 90s, and thinking Merlot was going to be it, a wine that was fairly easy to grow and then produce and would come in early and they could pump it out. And a lot of bad Merlot went out there. And with a lot of that bad Merlot was a lot of the reputation of that variety being etched away. And then Sideways hit, and that kind of sealed the deal. And Merlot went away, and Pinot Noir, because of that movie, skyrocketed, and a lot of the bad Merlot that had been grown went away. And what was left in Napa were these, and I can't speak to Walla Walla. Walla Walla has been producing great Merlots for a very long time. But in Napa, these little sweet spots around the valley remained. And I think places like Three Palms, which PJ oversees, and the couple of the vineyards that we have in the mountains, are really incredible places to grow this variety. And we're now making it with the understanding that we have these really great jewels and that they should be celebrated, and that there are people that understand, just as you said, that Massetto is out there and Petrus is out there. And these are some of the more sought after collectible wines in the world. And reminding people of that, reminding people that there's absolutely no reason that the Italians and the French should own that category, that Washington State has great Merlots, that Napa Valley has great Merlots, that Australia, you were mentioning some other places in Italy that have really great Merlots. It's a variety that, if you farm it right, can really produce wonderful and excellent wines. And all you got to do is taste these 3 wines, you get a sense of that.
Nicely said. Marty, PJ, anything to add?
I think for us, L'Ecole started in 1983. So I guess this is about our 38th year. And Merlot early on was really the only red wine that we produced. And there was a time there in the early 90s where we, that many of the many of the wine critics thought Merlot was going to be the red wine that Washington State, banked its reputation on. And I think that, part of it, we're a little bit cooler and we have a harder winter, a little bit cooler spring, but then this really sunny, warm catch up summer. And because that cycle is a little bit different, I think that also imparts a little bit different character with the Merlots that we produce. But one thing about it is we really have to modestly crop. We cannot crop really anything we do up here very heavy, or it may not get ripe.
Well, let me ask you, I'm going to ask you about the difference between Washington and California Merlot in a minute. But just to go back to this idea of how to, I don't know, get people to really realize that grape Merlot is one of the world's world-class varieties. I mean, maybe there is no problem here. Maybe people really understand it. Although I myself notice sometimes when you say, we could do this lineup of Cabernets, or we could do this lineup of great Merlots. Sometimes people say, oh, let's do the lineup of Cabernets. Maybe they don't understand quite well. PJ, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, it's I guess a comment on it. It's funny. So at Duckhorn, obviously we've been doing Merlot forever. It's what we do. But it's funny, and Chris mentioned Sideways. We kind of have a challenge anytime there's a media article or something like this. We count how many words it takes to mention Sideways when we're talking about Merlot, and it's usually about like that. It's usually about the third sentence we end up talking about Sideways. I think a couple things from our vantage point, from Duckhorn's vantage point, my own personal vantage point is, when the Sideways event happened, there was two things that were kind of cool. It was not easy if you were hanging your hat on Merlot, but it was a thinning of the herd, right? There was a lot of not great Merlot out there. And I think a lot of the trade especially saw it as an excuse. If they had 25 Merlots on their list, 22 of them weren't great. And they saw it as an excuse they saw it as a reason to move those off their list. And of the three that were left, it's the three of us that are here today, maybe a couple others that I can think of, and a couple of them don't make Merlot anymore. So it was a distillation of the interest in Merlot to good Merlot, and kind of through that second cool part was then a survival of the fittest of who was left after that culling of the herd, if you will. So that was one event. The challenge of bringing Merlot to people, I think, is definitely softening versus going to market with these wines in 2006, 2007, 2008. And actually, again, to follow on Chris, kind of similar, I think, somewhat of the same phenomenon with Rosé and White Zinfandel, right? When I grew up, Rosé in California was a joke because it was sweet and it was a 4 million case brand that came out of the valley. And then you saw kind of everybody forget about that. And then suddenly Rosé could be good again. And there was like this, it was a generational thing. You had to get rid of 20 years worth of wine knowledge to then be open to Rosé in California again. And I think Merlot is just got to that place in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I love this idea that the people who remained standing were the people who really had expertise and who really had the vineyards to support something delicious, something really worth drinking. And a lot of the, flotsam and jetsam just sort of went away. Let's set the context for these wines for a minute, because I want to spend a little bit of time having all of our viewers really understand your wineries before we start tasting them. And I'm really excited to taste these wines. And Marty, I do want to go back and start with you because, and to pick up with what you were saying earlier, because I remember I was one of those journalists who thought, wow, Merlot, Washington, it will be, Washington will be one of the great spiritual homes for Merlot. But of course, at the time that I thought that, and the time a lot of people thought that, much of what was planted in Washington were white grapes, right? So all of a sudden it seemed surprising. But you've been a Merlot pioneer, and certainly not just in Washington, but certainly in Walla Walla since the early 80s. So I wanted to ask you, you started to go there and I interrupted, but what does differentiate in your mind Washington Merlot from California Merlot? I know it's a big question, but.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things. One, we have really unusual soils in that, millions, 15 million years ago, there was lots of volcanic lava flows in this area. And so we have places where we have vineyards planted in volcanic basalt. And then there were these glacial ice age floods that inundated eastern Washington, and we have locations that literally are planted in glacially ground granitic particulate soils. And so there's some because these were very big events, there's some uniformity in the soils. But the other thing that's really probably makes the region unique is that this hard, cold winter, late bud break spring, and then this really super sunny, extra sunlight, hours of photosynthesis. And during the whole period of time, you have this significant warm day, cool night cycle. And I think it's that combination of soils and how the ripening cycle of the grape that really puts a marker on the fruit we have.
But what is that marker? For someone who just asked you, what's the taste difference? What would you say?
We have more red fruit. There tends to be more earth, more, a little bit more floral, rose aromatics in the wine, kind of a violet note, you might say. Whereas with many of the delicious Napa Merlots here, they're much darker fruit, black fruit driven. And so
Right.
those are the main things.
Yeah. Chris, let's talk about La Jota's history for a second. The winery began in the late 1800s. It's up on Howell Mountain in the Napa Valley on the more or less volcanic east side. And, many of the top Merlots are not soft per se, not in the way of inexpensive Merlot, but certainly mountain Merlot up where La Jota is not soft. Could you tell, if you had a blind tasting of a bunch of mountain Merlots and Cabernets, could you tell them apart in a blind tasting?
That's a good question. I would like to think that I could, because I've been in the mountains for some time. I don't know that I would be exact, but I make Merlot on 3 different mountains. On Spring Mountain, which is much more similar to Walla, and it's more red fruit, more floral. I make a Merlot on Mount Veeder. That's just as you would expect a Mount Veeder Merlot to be: blue fruit, real spice, a minerality that's like wet shale. And then I make these Merlots here. And you were a little bit earlier, before all your guests came on, we were talking about that photograph behind me. That's Merlot, and that has been around since 1986, and in fact helped build the Duckhorn program. When Tom Rinaldi was buying Merlot from the what was then the Liparita vineyard, he was buying that fruit right there and establishing what really great Merlot was in Napa Valley. And down the road was La Jota. And Bill wasn't making Merlot at the time. He was concentrating mostly, on Cab Franc, and he made for a number of years awesome Petit Syrah. But when I got up there, when we, as a organization, acquired La Jota, I had been making Merlot from that vineyard for a while for Cardinal. In fact, all of the fruit that Tom used to get that went into the Duckhorn Merlot now forms the backbone of the Merlot portion of Cardinal, and we have a vineyard designate Merlot. This Merlot that we're tasting today is not that. But what I recognized is that there's a real distinctive character to Merlot on these mountainsides, as distinctive as Cabernet, and that people that are questioning Merlot's ability to have nuance, to have power, to have a grip and a tannin to it, would be really surprised and really intrigued by Merlots off these mountains. And so the very first Merlot that we pursued within this group of awesome vineyards that I get to oversee in Napa was the Howell Mountain Merlot. And it was based on my early years drinking those Howell Mountain Merlots from Duckhorn that crazy man Tom Rinaldi made. Still has a connection to this vineyard.
Yes. Well, and we're going to, in fact, when we taste the wines, we are going to taste your La Jota last because of that. And yes, Tom Rinaldi, the original great winemaker of Duckhorn. Let's go to the story of Duckhorn for a minute. PJ, Dan and Margaret Duckhorn began in 1976. And unusually at the time claimed Merlot as the grape that they were going to make a single varietal wine. And it seems straightforward today, but back then, you know, most people just used it, at least in the Napa Valley back then, most people used it as a blending grape. What do you think prompted Dan to decide, no, Duckhorn's going to be based on Merlot?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, yeah, like as you mentioned, founded in 1976. So Duckhorn and Apple Computers actually had the same birthday, April 1st, 1976, which is cool. The day both companies were incorporated. And then, but the first vintage was 1978, and the first vintage was Three Palms Merlot. And Dan, you know, kind of the tried and true story, but you know, that we've heard since, but at that point was very unique. Dan had spent some time in Pomerol. On, you know, in Bordeaux on the right bank, and had just fallen in love with Merlot. I think for all the reasons that I would guess we're all in love with Merlot in terms of its structure and depth, but also its drinkability and those characteristics paired in a very graceful package. And so he was peripherally involved in the wine business. He came back. He was friends with a guy named Rick Foreman, who was the founding winemaker at Sterling. And there's always been a very strong connection between Sterling and Three Palms, familial actually at that point, and then a strong business relationship afterwards. And Rick just said, hey, if you're serious about Merlot, and Dan was excited about it, he said, I got to take you out to Three Palms. And kind of the rest was history, essentially. So started there. At Three Palms, as Dan will tell you, they decided to focus on Merlot, which nobody was doing, and they were going to charge 2.5 times as much as anybody else was. So the first vintage was $12.50 a bottle, and they went out in the market, and everybody told them they were crazy for being so expensive. And but that's he wanted to do it well, and he wanted to do it from Three Palms. And then very quickly, and as Dan will tell it, and you know, I'm sure that every word is factual. There's not an ounce of bluster in any of this, but that as they were trying to figure out how to make these wines, that Tom Rinaldi pulled up to the winery and on his motorcycle in his leather jacket and said, you guys need a winemaker. I'm going to be your winemaker. And the rest was history.
One, I do have to say, I mean, I know Dan Duckhorn pretty well. As a young journalist, he would be the person I would come and visit, and he would, during the harvest, let me ride on the back of the gondola with him as he took out leaves and screamed at people to do things. And Tom Rinaldi, another character, has even to this day in my office in St. Helena sometimes just come by for no good reason. He's not dropping off wine. He's not doing anything. He just comes by at 4 o'clock because he knows we're tasting then. And we'll sit down and say, what are we tasting?
Yep.
Uninvited. Yes.
On a bike ride usually, right?
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, let's taste these wines. Enough telling of fun old stories. And I want to begin, Marty, with your wine, your 2017 Estate Merlot. Here's L'École's beautiful schoolhouse label, because L'École means school, and it is in an old schoolhouse. So tell us about this wine. And I must say, in tasting it just a minute ago, one of the things I really have always liked about this wine is its freshness. Okay,
great. Well, this is our Walla Walla Estate Merlot. And the two vineyards that are in this blend are Seven Hills Vineyard, one of the oldest vineyards in the valley, first planted in 1980 and expanded several times along the way. Seven Hills today is actually a partnership with between Lacole, Leonetti, and Pepperbridge. And each of us, we have our own specific blocks of fruit. And so we've been making wine from Seven Hills Vineyard since our first Merlot in Walla Walla was our 1993 Seven Hills Vineyard Merlot. And then along the way, as there was, kind of a number of warm years, we tended to start planting in higher elevations. And our Ferguson vineyard, named after my wife's parents, Jean and Baker Ferguson, was planted first in 2008, and it's about 1,500 foot elevation. It happens to be on the same ridge that Seven Hills Vineyard is on. I know you know that because you've been there, but it's about 500 feet higher up. And when you get to that high of an elevation, the amount of soil on top of the basalt is very shallow. And so the vines really are creeping down into this hardened, fractured basalt. And so with the elevation, you get the characteristics of a high elevation site, which typically is a little more concentration, a little darker fruit, more tannin phenolic structure, and higher natural acidity. But the unique thing about the Ferguson vineyard is that basalt minerality that comes into the wine. And so this really is a blend between the pretty, elegant side of Seven Hills Vineyard married in with the high elevation structure and basalt minerality of Ferguson.
And I want to remind viewers that one of the easy ways to think about basalt is as cooled lava. My friend, the geologist, David Howell, will probably write me an email after this saying that's too simplistic, but it is a good, simple way of thinking about basalt. It's a delicious wine. PJ, Chris, any comments here?
It's fantastic. That's a fantastic wine. And you can't, and I can't, even pretend that Marty's Washington knowledge. I've got to hang out a little bit up there. We have a project on Red Mountain called Canvasback, and every once in a while we get to go down to Walla Walla because the food's a little better there than in Benton City. And I've been up to Seven Hills, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about Howell Mountain later on. But I always think of Howell Mountain as red dirt and rocks, and I think of where Seven Hills is just rock. There's this really cool cut where you go in, and it's like a loading yard for them, and there's this 40-foot wall of basalt. And there's vines on top of it, and it is pure rock, and then maybe 6 inches of dirt right there at the top, and it's windswept. It's hardcore, but this wine is beautiful.
PJ's describing Ferguson Vineyard.
Right there at the top of Seven, yeah.
Yeah. We have a number of comments coming in, and Marty, several people are drinking a couple of your vintages of Lacole right now. But before we go to PJ, I do, Barry has had a good comment here. This comment came in a while ago, but first he said that, when we all remember when the big 60 Minutes piece came out on the French paradox, the idea that drinking red wine was very good for you, and that was perhaps even heart protective. He points out that a lot of basic Merlot was made then as just a red wine for every night drinking. But then he notes that in the 2000s, and I remember this, in the mid 2000s or mid 2010s, Merlot began to outsell all other varieties in the United States. There was that moment, and sales are very up now as well. He's wondering what accounts for it, and I wonder if texture is a reason. PJ, we're going to your wine next, so why don't you address that, and then we'll slide right into the Duckhorn.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So in the texture is a key component in the drinkability of Merlot. I honestly fundamentally if I could get my Merlot soapbox out for a second, Merlot can be the perfect wine. I think what a lot of Cabernet drinkers are looking for is actually much more readily available in good Merlot than in the general Cabernet. You know, if in terms of structure and depth, but at the same time, having that velvety texture and those fine grained tannins, being able to match really well with steak, but also be drinkable on its own, and I don't think a lot of the Cabernet and the vernacular of like high-end Cabernet today fits that mold. It's fundamentally a fantastic wine when it's made really well. So I think that speaks to its popularity, if I could. And then chat about this wine in particular.
Yeah, let me hold up the label to the camera here. There we go.
Yeah.
Here's the Duckhorn 2017 Napa Valley Merlot. And because you in particular work on vineyards and are head of vineyards for Duckhorn, I'm wondering if both about the flavor of this wine, but also if there's one thing about a vineyard that you say to yourself, oh man, now that makes a really good Merlot vineyard.
Yeah. So first on the wine, so yes to both, of course. First on the wine, I think, so we have this really cool, I think one of probably the thing that is worth the most about Duckhorn Vineyards is our footprint of both estate vineyards and grower vineyards for Merlot in the Napa Valley, which was cultivated by Dan and then kind of stewarded by Alex Ryan, our CEO, and a couple of us other lucky people that have gotten to work with the footprint of vineyards. And as we spoke about, the pressure on Merlot as a varietal was so great for a time that if it stayed in the ground, it had to be good and it had to have a home. And we were lucky to be the winery that got to bring in a lot of this fruit from these long-term relationships. So, you know, we literally work from against the edge of San Pablo Bay in Carneros up to, you know, the Solari vineyard on the northernmost vineyard on the valley floor, and work with Merlot across all those. And the goal being that you bring those to the blending table. We're going to make one wine, the Napa Valley Merlot, with 40 components or 50 components, and being able to then make sure you're hitting a balanced wine style every year from all these vineyards we've worked with forever is kind of one of the coolest parts of the job. And then of course, and our estate vineyards kind of span that whole length of the Napa Valley, so getting to play with those as well. In terms of a vineyard site that's going to work well for Merlot, it's really it's oddly, it can do really well in a lot of places. It just gets increasingly more difficult, and the yields fluctuate greatly. As I mentioned, you can make fantastic Merlot. Tom Rinaldi, some of my favorite wines I've ever had from Napa are Tom Rinaldi's Carneros Merlots. He made it while he was at Provenance, and I'm probably not supposed to say other wines while I'm here, but those wines were fantastic from the Las Amigas vineyard. And then Three Palms is up in Calistoga, where it's technically, you know, if you've looked on some charts, it's too hot for Merlot. So I think it comes down to how you're farming it, right? You have to watch what the vine's doing, and the vine's going to do a different thing every year. That's one of the fun things about Merlot. It's going to try to go vigorous. It's going to try to go under vigorous. It's going to try to have too much fruit. It's going to try to not have enough fruit. And so you have to kind of duck and weave with the varietal year in, year out. But a lot of sites, as long as the site's not too vigorous, not too cold, and truly not too hot, and by that, you know, I mean, you kind of have to get in the interior for that to be true, because it is versatile. You're going to have a kind of a running shot at making a great wine, but just knowing it's not going to be as easy as even, you know, Cabernet next to Merlot in terms of growing them. And I think making them is two different ballgames.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So let's go to Chris and the La Jota wine now. And let's taste this La Jota. It's reflecting a little bit, but there you see the La Jota script. Chris, tell us about this wine. And I guess the question I want to always ask you is, when you're making a mountain wine like this, because the Duckhorn and because the La Colle reference softness and a sense of beauty, can you take mountain Merlot and think about beauty and elegance too, or are these kind of diametrically opposed ideas?
That's a good question. But before, and I'm learning from watching the debates, I wanted to go back to the question that Barry answered, because, the reason we were selling so much Merlot in the early aughts, moving up to that movie that I shall not mention because I don't want to have PJ's colleagues say that he won the bet, it was marketing. All those plantings for Merlot, remember, the industry wanted something that would replace white Zin because PJ's generation was getting turned off by it. And Merlot, because it is soft and because it's fairly easy to grow in bulk, not as a fine wine, they planted it everywhere in the middle 90s. All that fruit started pouring into the wineries in the early aughts. And so they got to sell it. And so marketing jumped on it and started promoting Merlot all over the place. And unlike Tom Rinaldi's Merlots from the Carneros, a lot of really bad Merlot was being produced at that time. And that's why you saw this rise and then that sudden dip. We love making wine, and we love growing wine, but we're still a business, and those kind of decisions were being made at that time. So yeah, I just wanted to, that's my opinion about Barry's question. So Mountain Merlot, and yeah, Mountain Merlot is a different beast. It's got power. It's got the texture. It's got a middle body that goes on forever. But there are places that do quite well that are softer, more elegant. And we talked about Walla and the Seven Hills Vineyard, which I was just at recently. It's an incredible spot. But Spring Mountain is another example of a place in Napa that the tannin expression is different, and there's a lot more floral and elegance and beauty. And I make another wine called Caledon, that's a Cab Franc Merlot blend that really highlights that. But on Hull Mountain, that's not the game. The Hull Mountain, you're playing up to the terroir that you're given. And this wine, I gotta be honest, this is a blend. I have become enamored of the combination of Merlot and Petit Verdot. And I started this experiment with I think it was the 15 or the 16 Lahota Merlots. And it's just, they're very yin and yang varieties, and they bring different characteristics to the table. And the Merlot or the Petit Verdot definitely helps add another level of that mountain terroir to the wine, but also a lot of that black fruit and that black pepper. And I've done the same thing with the Merlot I make in Australia. I've started backfilling it with Petit Verdot, and it's really a wonderful variety combination. So does that answer your question?
No. Well, no, in a way, because you don't think about Petit Verdot as having beauty and elegance. It's a bit of a sledgehammer. Usually
it's
used
a monster. Yeah, it is, and you got to be really careful with it, because a wee bit of Petit Verdot can go forever. Now that said, that Petit Verdot is going up against a Mountain Merlot, so you can play with it a little bit more. I think I've used as little as 2 or 3%, and in this particular vintage, it was a good portion of it. Yeah, I mean I think it really highlights this wine. So,
I'm going to ask Marty and PJ what they think about this, and also what you and Marty think about the Duckhorn in a second. But Barry is really following along here, and he has said, because we've all referenced a bit some innocuous and not very good Merlots, and he's asking if we can name some of those lousy wines. And I'm going to say, no, we can't, but I will tell you that the men in Sideways were lousy men. That is my comment on this as the woman in charge here.
They were.
So let's go back, because I did neglect to, when we tasted the Duckhorn, but of course we could go back and forth, and that's the most fun thing about wine anyway, in a tasting. I want to go back and taste that Duckhorn and get Marty and Chris to talk about this wine. because I think this, so maybe because I know Dan Duckhorn, I can feel his thinking about softness in this wine.
Well, I'll pitch in. Look, first off, L'Ecole and Duckhorn have been friends for a long time. And of course, Duckhorn has now canvas back on Red Mountain, but the winery is in Walla Walla. And to tie those little dots together, Brian Rudine, who's a winemaker at Canvasback, actually worked at L'Ecole some years ago. So we have a lot of connections. I've always been a big fan of this wine, and it's always just really elegant, very balanced, but that dark fruit, plum, licorice, all tend to pop. But it really just has an incredibly balanced finish. It's a great wine.
Mm. Both of your wines, by the way, are really juicy. Both the Duckhorn and the L'Ecole have a kind of, it's funny to call wine wet because it is wet, but a kind of juiciness that is mouthwatering, that is really nice in red wine. So let's go to Chris's wine again too, and get some thoughts on that. One of the things that I felt in actually not even tasting it, but just before we all came on, in smelling this wine, was I don't know, I call it kind of Chinese five spice, some kind of exotic spicy aroma that I don't usually associate with Merlot.
That's the petite.
Oh, hey, I was right on that. Okay, never mind. That's the petite. Aha, okay. Secret ingredients, secret sauce, so to speak.
I will, and absolutely, I think Chris obviously knows totally well. The Howell Mountain Merlots we've worked with, Eastone, 2 vineyards up there now, and 1. There is always in kind of all the wines, but especially Merlots, like it's not exactly what you noted, Karen, but like a mocha, cigar box, tobacco, kind of somewhere weaving through those, like cedar. You know, there's this like lifted dark other note that's always in those wines. So I'm sure that petite can be that like really abundant floral spicy note, and I'm sure that's what's showing through. But I also have always found that in Howell Mountain Merlots that I've worked with as well.
Yeah, let me pose to all of you. Well, there's a wonderful comment from Eric saying, not a question, but a comment. My wife never liked wine until I gave her an aged Merlot to taste. And she's been an avid wine drinker ever since. Yum, good. And then a question, an anonymous question asking if any of you feel that your wine needs to be decanted, which we're tasting young wine, so just decanted, meaning poured into a carafe of some sort to be opened up. I'm assuming the question is. Better to pour it into a carafe and open it up, or?
Our wine for sure is better with opening up. And that is in part because this wine is built with, some structure for better aging potential. And with that, with it being this young, when you decant it, that air just really helps lift the aromatics and smooth things out a bit. So for sure, when a wine this young, it does better.
I'm thinking all 3 of these wines would benefit from that, or at the very least, drinking from good, generously sized glasses. These wines are, putting a red wine that wants to unfurl itself into a small glass is like putting a big person in a small airplane seat. It's just really uncomfortable. You can feel that it's really uncomfortable. The wine wants to unfurl. So at the very least, right, a big, generous glass. But
yeah, I was just gonna say for the Duckhorn, more air on these young wines is never gonna hurt. Just this wine, I've had it open for 45 minutes or so and had it in the glass for about 45 minutes. and it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's at its peak, but it has certainly opened up really nicely. So I think, anything from opening, an hour, just kind of splashing a little in a glass, getting a little air in the bottle is going to help, but decanting is never going to hurt.
Yeah, and Chris, that has to be true for the La Jota. It's a pretty packed wine. It really benefits from.
Mountain wines in general are really good to put in decanter. PJ, I'm curious, what vineyards are the source for your Merlot?
Oh, it's a list, Chris, honestly. I think this wine has 9 sub-AVAs in it. So that, it's literally, there's stuff up on Atlas Peak. There's stuff in Carneros we like. Oak Knoll, Yountville, we have vineyards in Oakville. It kind of moves all the way up the valley. The key components in this particular wine would be, and they're not going to make up the majority, but key components stylistically that always drive this wine are the Solari vineyards up in Calistoga, Bruno and his family up there. The Carneros piece, just kind of that dark anchor, that kind of earthy component, always comes out of Carneros for that. Atlas Peak provides kind of a broad shoulder rustic tannin profile to this wine. And then the kind of the estate components, which would be primarily St. Helena and Yountville, driving kind of some of that higher tone red fruit Merlot.
So gentlemen, I'm being asked a question that I want to ask you, which is, this is coming from Ashburn, who's saying, you've mentioned, meaning I've mentioned, that I like cabs at around 10 years old when they are not quite old yet, but no longer young. And so the question is, when would you, not when would you drink Merlot? Because obviously we would drink it right now, and we would also drink it, if it's a great one, 15 or 20 years from now. But when is a really interesting time? If you were going to age it, when would that time be? 8 years, 5 years, 12 years? What would you say?
Well, I'm a fan of that, something in the 7 to 8 year period for our wines, just because they definitely tend to have the backbone to carry it that long. And at that point, your aromatics are just much more lifted. There's a little more integration in the mouthfeel. They definitely go longer than that. That's not like a peak when I say that. That's just right, where the wine is really beginning to show well.
Okay. Anyone else want to grab that?
It depends what you like, right? If you like really young wines and you don't want the tannin, our Merlots tend to start resolving themselves in 4 or 5 years. The tannins start to modify a little bit. But we've been tasting some older vintages recently, and we started the Merlot for La Jota. La Jota hadn't had any Merlots until we acquired it, and we started that label in 2005. I had a 2008 recently, and the fruit was still carrying, but it had this incredible cedar and cigar box, and building on what PJ was saying about the tobacco side of it, it was pronounced but not overwhelming, and it still had a lot of fruit, and it was wonderful. Some people may not like that. It just depends where you are with your palate and how it's developing as you age. And so I recommend you buy a case and you have a bottle every few years, and then you can learn with me. That's my recommendation.
Did you steal that idea from me? I always say that too. That's the whole premise of a case. I mean, if you think about it, why do cases even exist? They originally existed so that people could buy a group of wines and watch them over time. That was the whole aesthetic idea. It's an important and wonderful thing to do. If you know you like an estate, then the most fun thing to do is to buy more than one bottle and open it at different times and watch its personality, right? It is the most fun thing to do. Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I'm afraid we are a bit out of time. I want to, though, before we end, just because, and Marty, you'll forgive us for this, but both Duckhorn being right there on the Silverado Trail and its vineyards right behind it, and La Jota being on Howell Mountain in the mountains, both of these properties were quite close to the Glass Mountain fires that are still ongoing a bit, although contained for the most part now. But gentlemen, are both of your wineries okay?
They're okay, or I'm okay. We're okay. I can't
Yeah.
speak for Chris, but I think the same
And Chris?
Yeah, our La Jota, the winery, is in the Las Posadas area of Howell Mountain. So the fires were on the other side behind on the northern part of Howell. So the winery is fine. The grapes, we're still learning about how good those are or not.
Yeah. Well, it certainly has been, it's been a more than challenging year. But what's in our glasses right now is a testament to all three of you. So I'm very grateful for your participation tonight and for letting us taste these wines. And I think for everyone who has these wines in their glass right now, speaking of air, right, watch them throughout the evening, taste them with the dinner tonight. You'll see how they, I love that word, unfurl, how they reveal themselves over the course of the evening. And if you haven't had these wines yet, I think they are really worthy of your consideration. So for my part, I'm Karen MacNeil, author of the Wine Bible. And thank you, PJ. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Marty. And good night.
Cheers. Thanks, y'all.
Cheers. Enjoyed it.